So moving swiftly on to this evening's talk, I'm delighted to welcome three speakers who are going to talk about Noël Rees, the English Consul, Chief of British Intelligence in the Eastern Mediterranean during the Second World War. This is a rare example for us of being able to present family research. The Levantine Heritage Foundation model is very much one of a collaboration between independent researchers, many of them looking into their own families, and academic researchers. The one has access to many private records, not otherwise visible. The other can provide academic context, background, and very often we find that a very useful combination in events such as these. So I would encourage everyone to help further the research that Noël, Tom, and George put together. If you're an academic and can provide context, that would be excellent. If you are a member of the extended Levantine family or the Rees family, again, your contributions would be most welcome. And if anyone would like to be connected after the event, we would be very happy to help with that. So I'm now going to hand over, I think it's going to be, George, are you going to speak first?
Ready.
Okay, so I'll stop sharing.
I'm going to share my screen because this is relevant to what George is going to say.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, good evening. It's still morning for me here in Denver, where I'm speaking at the foot of the Rocky Mountains. What I want to speak briefly about is the question I posed to myself, which was, why was Petros Makris-Styko's work on the English Consul, in Greek, of course, why did it come to be? The first thing that spontaneously comes to mind in this whole discussion is going back to my Latin days. The poet, author of the Aeneid, begins his story with notice of the man. And that's what this is about. My immediate focus, though, is about the woman whom you see on the screen, Zoe Helen Rees, Noël Rees' daughter, of course. My only warrant to speak this at this gathering, to remember the work of Lieutenant Commander Noël Rees, Noël Carlisle Rees, is above all his daughter Zoe Helene Woolrych, my wife. Were she not a victim of a form of dementia, she would be very moved by our interest in her father. Her own interest gives evidence of great loyalty to the memory of her father and of his well-known dedication. Commander Rees.
Doesn't that always happen?
Yes, sorry. Commander Rees' greatness as chief in gathering intelligence for the sake of escape and evasion was one on Aegean waters and mainland Greece during the years of 1939 through 44. Vessels used in the campaigns were anchored at Kiosti on the Turkish coast, 12 miles opposite occupied Chios. Noël may have more to tell us about such things. Zoe's own work for the coming to be of the English Consul began alongside her mother, Elise. Zoe's cousin, Tom Rees, tells us in Adventures in the Levant, before her father was sent an assistant in the family home in Buja, outside Izmir, Turkey, Zoe and her mother helped decoding classified telegraph messages. The point being, there's a long history of Zoe and her father, and interest in her father's work. The coming to be of, in Greek, of the English Consul began there, followed by Zoe's years of reading and contacting participants and scholars of the war on the Aegean and mainland. Finally came the successful search, her successful search for the author of the English Consul, Petros Staikos. Her decades-long project to bring us what began with her seeing her father's work concludes with Petros's masterful documentation. I am well aware of it, and of those who honorably worked alongside the British Consul. That is my tribute to Zoe, especially for the coming to be of the English Consul, and therefore of this gathering tonight at the Levantine Heritage Foundation. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to, for those of you who don't, I do recognize a number of family names in the list on the screen. I have a slight advantage in that IT is my business. So I have a socking great big screen with all of you on it, so I can see everything all of the time, which does help. I'm Noël, named after my grandfather. I did have the slight misfortune to be named after both my grandfathers to save embarrassment in terms of a sort of family feud context. Right, let me start by resharing my screen to where we've got to. There we go. You should have that come up now. Okay. Noël Rees, I'm going to give you a little bit of background as to where he came from, or where the family came from, and a little bit of an explanation and background, and then Tom will take over and do a little bit more in between. I have to say that I have plagiarized a number of authors to put a lot of the photographs that I'm using are very original ones with my grandfather's annotations on the back of them, as we'll see as we go through. Okay, the Rees family originated in the small town of St. Clears, which is in, let's change the color. I think that is probably not a good one. Let's go for red, which is a bit easier to see. There we go. Okay, St. Clears in Carmarthenshire. This church and the photos that you'll see in it, you may, if you've been interested or been following the restoration requests for the organ in the church in Buja, this is a very similar commemorative window to the one there. I'm sure Tom will correct me, great-great-great-grand originally came from St. Clears. If you've read Tom's book, which is this one, Merchant Adventures in the Levant, it gives an exceedingly good history of how my family got from St. Clears to Smyrna. but it effectively evolved all around the need to import a red dye called nada root, which came from Turkey. And as a result of that, the family business started to evolve to something a lot bigger, particularly during the Crimean War. It then became a multinational empire as such. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So as a background, Noël was born in Smyrna, which is now Izmir in Turkey, the son of Thomas Bowen Rees, and the company that was formed was Thomas Bowen Rees shipping company, and Zoe Theophany Wherry, which is of another family, of which was quite a degree of interest. Both myself, Tom Rees, and Noël, my grandfather, were educated at Harrow, and in a lot of cases, this is probably why he managed quite so well later on in life. As most of you will probably have gathered from some of the background information, he was based in Izmir and Alexandria, and spent most of his time moving between the two. Summers were spent on the island of Rhodes, and I'll show you some pictures which were quite significant of there. He actually built the villa in Rhodes at the age of 23, so you can get a feel of the wealth that the family had. He then happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right connections. James Bond has actually got very little on this, but because he had considerable attributes which were incredibly valuable at the time, this is how he ended up getting diplomatic immunity in 2 countries and a commission in the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, and therefore a lead into intelligence. The company T-Bone Rees, a couple of images there. You can see one of the ships, at the entrance door, which is the picture on the right, is actually still there. The building is still there, it still exists. And the bottom left-hand corner, there are a balustrade made out of ship's wheels, out of various of the ships that they owned. And they had quite an extraordinary range within the company. They basically got the rights or the contract to supply the British military in the Eastern Mediterranean. So if you can imagine that you're dealing with, from the Crimean War onward, many of you may be familiar with the term that was used to describe British troops as le beef, because a lot of the beef that was supplied initially came from what is now Russia. They also held the dredging rights to the Suez Canal, a bit like, for those of you who remember the Fourth Road, it was an unending job. You started painting it and you went back to the beginning. Many of you may remember a couple of years ago, a very large ship got stuck in the Suez Canal for the reason that it hadn't been dredged properly. And this was one of the jobs that the company dealt with. To preempt questions that may come up a bit later, all this disappeared as a result of ships being sunk during the Second World War, and then the Suez Crisis, when the British were chucked out of Egypt. Outside the villa in Rhodes, and the background hasn't changed very much, except it's now full of hotels. This is a photograph of Noël with his brothers. As I mentioned earlier, he was educated at Harrow School. Didn't have what I could fathom, a particularly good academic career. Most of his time was spent involved in sport. Tom will probably recognize recognize these photographs because he may well be in others similar. I certainly am. What I didn't know is that he actually played in the band. Don't even know what instrument he played. I know he was seated somewhere. I can't remember exactly where he was. So he left school and that was it. He went back to the Mediterranean. Horse racing was an absolute passion. And he had a number of successful winners, which those are two of them. He was also very keen tennis, and this is him receiving a cup in Athens. This only came up last night in the rerun. He married Alice Marie-Jean, who was originally Diab, but the daughter of Eleni Xidis. And this was a very interesting background because Eleni was a lady of somewhat loose morals. She had already had one ill child, and then she fell pregnant again. Rumor has it that it was by a senior member of the Greek royal family. Rumor takes it slightly further that it might have been Prince Andrew, but we have no confirmation of that. But it's the family would like to think it, which makes me the great nephew of His Royal Highness the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. Now, whether that actually is true or not, we don't know, but it makes a very good family story. Like James Bond, he was dead keen on cars. These are a couple of his cars on the island of Rhodes. Now, if you go back into this era, most of us think that roads as in tarmac, is stuff that you drive on. Well, when these cars were around, as you can see, fairly old by modern types of vehicles, there was only one metalled road, actually tarmacked, on the island of Rhodes, and that went between Rhodes town and the airport, which was right in the middle of the island. So to have two cars of this size was quite exceptional. You'll see he also has a chauffeur who's holding the door open. And I believe the gentleman behind him is a lad called Rees, who changed his name to George so that he could get rid of his wives. He was the family's cook. So cars were quite important. They also were quite a spectacle when they were loaded, because those of us who live in this modern age of roll-on, roll-off ferries, they didn't exist in the 1920s and early 30s. They had to literally swing these cars off a boat onto the quayside in Rhodes Harbour. So, you know, it was something that the local folk would go along and watch. And he'd drive these beautiful cars all around the island. Each member of the Rees family, the men, had their own yachts. Now, most people think of yachts as sort of 4, 5, 6 meter things with a sail on it. These are 500-ton steamships. They're not just sailing boats. And they used to park them outside the villa, or just off the shore of the villa in Rhodes. These are a couple more of Noel's yachts. The Icaros, which was a beautiful sailing boat. The other one's the Branwyn, which did eventually get commandeered by the Navy during wartime. On the island of Rhodes, he built this villa in the middle. You can see the what is actually described as Villa Alice, which is what it was built in, I suppose, as a memory of, or you know, of his wife, Alice. The interesting thing about this is he sort of stole a bit of the foreshore, which is still there at the moment. The villa was built in, or started to be built in 1928, which I think Noel was 23 years old. So this is quite a substantial building. It's got 7 bedrooms, several bathrooms, big reception rooms, and quite literally is on the foreshore. And you can see from the images that we've got there that it is actually quite a large property, very close to the sea edge, and looked at from, whoops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. I've got one slide on, highlighter. It's this chunk here. So it's quite well situated. This is taken from the hills just above Rhodes, the village of Ixia. Now, more importantly, this is the villa. This was actually taken just the days before we did the big presentation and unveiling of the plaques to my grandfather. On the right is Villa Rees in Bujar. So that you can see that there is a degree of similarity, but not entirely. The main thing is that you did hear earlier that the radio messages that were transmitted to Noël and were decoded, this was actually the tower that the Radio Shack was located in. And I will tell you later something a little bit more about that tower, because there is some significant similarities, but actually one or two things that are quite interesting about it later on. We now move into the war years, and these were Noël's documents for identification as he passed around through various different agencies, but I'll go on to a few other ones later. I will stop my screen share at this point and let Tom come in and give you some background of what was going on in the Mediterranean at that time, because an awful lot of it is not understood, and there was an awful lot of squabbling and backbiting. So I will unshare mine and let Tom share his screen.
Fine. Well, hello, everybody, and good to be with you. So I thought it would be a good idea just to say something about the political background, not so much in England, but in Greece and the Mediterranean, a little bit about the context of Noël's entry into this turbulent sea of troubles. He was described, I think, in one of the introductions as a bit of a playboy, and I think that's probably a bit unfair, because he was a younger brother, and the family businesses were largely in my father's hands, and he was pretty keen to keep control of the businesses. So Noël was allowed to run the family headquarters in Alexandria when my father was away, but otherwise he wasn't given much of a look in. But he did a good job, and he was obviously intelligent and capable enough to show that run a successful, complicated operation, because shipping is a business with a lot of marshalling of logistics, and that's important. So it does help to explain why he was successful in actually finding the site and then mounting and then running the successful military intelligence operation in the Eastern Mediterranean when war broke out. Now, one has to remember that the family businesses had offices in Alexandria, but also in Smyrna, in Alexandretta, in Piraeus, and in London. So, and the Eastern Mediterranean was really our home patch. So Noël, who from a business angle knew the shipping lanes and the little harbours, also knew them at first hand from the extensive pleasure sailing that he did around the islands. And he had chums all over the islands with whom he had good relations. I saw somewhere that there was mention of pheasant shooting. I don't think there were any pheasants in that part of the world. I think they were partridges, and he would go and have a go at the partridges wherever the yacht landed up. So that's his sort of intelligence background. But I think it's worth saying something about the politics and the history of Greece prior to 1940, because it's extraordinarily turbulent time, and it bred the problems with the Greek resistance, which the British and any other would-be helpers like the Americans were to face both during the war and after the war. And to start with, there was the Great Smyrna disaster in 1922, when the Greek army was swept into the sea by Ataturk, and probably 100,000 people died in the Great Fire at Smyrna. And the failure of the army and the association of the monarchy with the army at that time meant that after the war, there was continuous tension between the Venizelos factions, and they were anti-monarchist, and Venizelos had been the man who had been egged on by Lloyd George and Clemenceau to make this fatal expedition into Smyrna with the Greek army. So there were Venizelos and the Republicans on one hand, but the Royalists, although they'd been associated with that military intervention, were essentially anti-Venizelos, because Venizelos himself was a Republican. So you had these two really powerful political factions in Greece, and there was constant alternation between them. There were military coups that were followed by civilian governments, followed by military coups. There was a constant sort of roundabout of political control. And in 1935, there had been a political democratic government with king in exile, but in 1935 there was another coup, military coup, and that resulted in the recall from exile of King George II. Now, King George had spent those pre-war years mostly in England. You have to remember the royal family was Danish by origin. I think I'm right in saying that. And George came back to Greece with a certain hostility to a lot of Greeks and Greek politicians who he thought had treated him badly, but also with considerable loyalty to the British. And he put in power this man here, Venizelos, who had been a general in the Greek army and had taken off his uniform to become a politician. He led the smallest party in the Greek parliament. But while he was there and after the return of the king, there was terrific turbulence in the country, and there was the imminent there was an announcement of an imminent realization of a general strike. And the king was, under the constitution, allowed to appoint the prime minister. And he appointed Metaxar, who had virtually no following in the parliament. But the other politicians had failed, and Metaxar came to power, and he instantly installed martial law and dissolved parliament. And there was very little resistance to this, I think because the politicians had all thrown up their hands in despair. And it was somehow accepted without the large-scale civil disturbances that you would have expected. And Metaxar installed a thoroughgoing fascist regime with control of the media. He did quite a lot of public works to appease the people. And he did a terrific lot of hard selling of the state. And he sympathized with Hitler and with Mussolini and with Franco in Spain, but he was a realist. And he knew that whoever controlled the Mediterranean provided the greatest guarantees for Greece and the independence of Greece. And he was a Greek nationalist. And Greek independence was his primary overriding political goal. So he went for Britain. And while making friendly noises towards the other fascist dictators, he came to an understanding, but not a treaty, with France and Britain, which provided some sort of guarantees to Greece in the event of attack from outside. Well, the attack from outside did actually come. And in 1940, Mussolini sent the Italian army over the border from Albania in very large numbers. And the Greek army, which had been really crushed by Ataturk, was sent to stop the Italian invasion. And it very successfully stopped the invasion. You can see there Metaxa gesturing to his army to stride into battle. And it actually threw the Italian army back to Albania. And it was bitter fighting. It was winter when they went. Well, that's not a winter photograph, but you can see in the next one.
Tom, you haven't shared your screen.
Oh, I thought I had.
No, it's not, nothing come up as far as I can see.
Ah, so none of you have seen these photographs, right? Well, let me go back to the beginning. I'm trying to share this screen. Ah, and my file disappeared. That's very annoying. Okay, I'm not sure how I get out of this dilemma. I may have to go on talking without images. The images are all library photographs, so you're not missing a lot, but I'm sad that my original photographs have gone. Okay, too bad. So the Italians were thrown back, and Metaxas then died very conveniently, because the result of the Italian defeat was that Hitler decided to take matters into his own hand, and the German army poured across the frontier from not Albania, but Macedonia. By this stage, the British had managed to put some troops into Greece. They were British and New Zealand troops, but there weren't enough of them. They tried to hold up the German advance near the Macedonian border. They staged a desperate last defense at Thermopylae, which once again was the narrow pass into Greece. And although they didn't hold for long, it gave them time to get the king away from Athens and originally to Crete, but Crete was under threat. And then they went to Cape Town. And from Cape Town, they eventually took refuge in Cairo, both the king and the government in exile. And Noël Rees' brother Willie, who had a business in Athens, accompanied the royal family on the sea journey to Cape Town. And there they were made comfortable by my father's shipping colleague, Eugene Eugenides, who's a great who figures in the Four Quartets by T.S. Eliot. There's a slightly sinister figure. And then they went to Cairo. Now, in Greece itself, after the government had left, the Greek Communist Party, which had been outlawed by Metaxa, began to emerge as the leading resistance group under the banner of EAM, the National Resistance Movement. And it got some support Republican Venezuelans, not from the monarchists, and from many who weren't either communists or socialists, but thought that EAM was the most likely to provide an effective resistance. There was also a smaller non-communist resistance, and this was part of the trouble. The two main groups, EDES and ECA, were led by former Venezuelan officers who had been cashiered after one of the many unsuccessful coups, this one in 1935. Britain attempted to promote collaboration between the left and right wings of the resistance movements, for obvious reasons. But it was a failure. And there were savage reprisal killings and bitter hostility between ELAS and the two non-communist groupings. And ELAS succeeded in almost wiping out EDES in 1943 and ECA in 1944. So this was the Greek resistance context in which these various British intelligence operations and others sought to work. MI6, which was conventional British military intelligence. We had MI9, which was the escape organization. And then there was this special operations executive. What to say about all that? So MI6 and MI9 were arms of the Secret Service, and they were very closely aligned with the foreign, and therefore their politics were essentially the politics of the British government. And that entailed support for the legitimate Greek government in Cairo. And their aim was to promote the defeat of the Axis forces. The subsidiary aim, of course, was to counter the Russian-backed Revolutionary Communist Party, the KKE, in Greece. And we now know that there were senior figures within British intelligence actively working to support revolutionary communism. And we found with Philby and McLean and Burgess and Blunt and all that lot after the war that they had been actively promoting the communist elements in the Balkans, including Greece. So even within the proper, as it were, British military intelligence services, there were conflicting forces at work. And that didn't make the operators on the ground easy. And Rees was hauled back to Cairo more than once because of complaints about his lack of enthusiasm for the leftist arm of the Greek revolutionary and resistance forces. Now, at the beginning of the war, the main British intelligence effort under MI6 and MI9, which Noël was involved in, was directed at helping Allied soldiers and Greek politicians and Greek soldiers to escape from Greece and the islands, and also to gather intelligence in the occupied territories. And from that, it extended to supplying the local resistance with arms and other materiel, wireless sets, and so on. These were difficult tasks in practice, but straightforward in principle. But the real tension within the Greek resistance, not tension, just hostility, violence, killings, made all this difficult. And then a new British secret service arrived on the scene, the SOE, the Special Operations Executive. Now, everybody knows a bit about the SOE because it did fantastic work all over Europe, very spectacular, sometimes successful, sometimes unsuccessful. Churchill has its mission to set Europe on fire, and its instructions were to work with the most effective of the anti-Axis forces, regardless of their political alignment. So they didn't care whether the Greek resistance was communist or non-communist. They just wanted to know who was good at killing Germans and sabotaging what the Greeks were doing, what the Germans were doing in Greece. And it had remarkable operatives who were chosen for such qualities as physical resilience and courage and initiative and intelligence and their knowledge of the country they operated. And their political master in London was the Ministry for Economic Warfare, whose head was the Labour politician Hugh Dalton. So that there was, you know, that strain of politics behind SOE. So in Cairo, some of the SOE staff running intelligence operations in the Eastern Mediterranean leaned towards the leftist and anti-monarchist and anti-government in exile elements in the Greek resistance. And there were clashes at Cairo headquarters between SOE on the one hand and MI6 and MI9 on the other. And the latter two, in line with government policy, were suspicious of the long-term intentions of AM and Elas, whom SOE favored. And you know Rees complained that on occasion that when he landed arms on the Greek islands or on the Greek mainland, and it was AM and Elas who picked them up, that they were likely to be taken away and stored against the coming revolution and not used against the Germans. And a certain amount of that was undoubtedly going on. And he thought that SOE was turning a blind eye or even facilitating this work because they were keen that the leftist part of the Greek resistance movement should win out. So that was the political difficulty for the intelligence services. But there's another angle to this, which was conflict was actually built into the coexistence of these two very different arms of the British Secret Services. MI6's kind of intelligence gathering relied on a network of informants on the ground and relatively free movement across the country. Surface calm and the absence of provocative incidents provided the most helpful milieu for MI6's agent informers. He didn't want the Germans patrolling at night and on edge, ready to shoot at any stranger wandering abroad after dark. And this was doubly true for MI9, which was one of the operations Noël was running, who were landing agents at night and smuggling escapers away from occupied territory. Now, SOE's tactics were diametrically opposed to the propagation of calm. They were blowing up bridges, sinking shipping, striking at airfields, and even, as in Crete, kidnapping an enemy general. So stirring the hornet's nest might be good for raising the morale of the occupied people, but it made life more dangerous by far for anyone suspected of being a collaborator with the resistance. As I'm sure you know, there were terrible reprisals in Crete after General Kneipe, was kidnapped by Paddy Lee Fermer and his chums. So SOE increased German vigilance in the areas where agents or equipment might be landed and risked making it more difficult to enlist and keep local support, because obviously people were terrified if they thought that they would be caught collaborating. Noël collaborated, often with some reluctance, with SOE, and later on the scene with the American OSS, who wanted action and thought that he was being obstructive. So there were turf wars. Well, that's the background. Noel will now tell you about what Noel got, his grandfather Noel got up to during his time as the organizer and supervisor of all these intelligence activities in the Eastern Med. Over to you,
Okay,
Noel.
thank you, Tom. I think, hold on a second, I'm just trying to find out my screen share here. Lovely, okay, that should be back up again. You can see from what Tom said, there was an enormous amount of turmoil going on around the Mediterranean, the early war years, in fact, throughout them. It's it's one of those things of being in the right place at the right time with the right skills, and everything sort of falls into place. Noel was, I suppose, very fortunate in the fact that whilst one might describe his lifestyle as swanning around the Mediterranean in the yacht, built up a huge number of contacts on the Greek islands, which now come into considerable play. He had a lot of trust and respect of an awful lot of people, whether they were Greek nationals or otherwise Turkey, or in Alexandria. So there was a lot of trust that had been built up. And if you're going to be a successful spy, for want of a better term, the one thing you do need is loyalty and trust and people who are prepared to take risks on your behalf. One of the advantages, I suppose, of all these things is diplomatic immunity. And this somewhat unprepossessing document granted Noel the British Vice Consul status on the island of Chios. So that is Greek territory. On the other side of the water, in Turkey, Anthony Eden, as you can see, has signed this document, Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, granting him similar vice consulship in Smyrna. So he's now in a position where he has diplomatic status in 2 countries, and particularly these ones, because there is a very good relationship between the countries that he's dealing with and the physical distances that they are apart. He was also then granted a commission in the Royal Naval Voluntary Reserve, which the actual Royal Navy tend to somewhat discouragingly describe them as the wavy navy, because the braid on the uniform, instead of being a complete circle, has a wave in it. Okay, in terms of geography, depending on how familiar you are with the area, this is the area of the Mediterranean, particularly that we're talking about. We've got Athens over the left-hand side. You've got the island of Chios, which is that one, and Turkey, obviously, to the right of that, and the island of Rhodes down here, which is where he built the villa. Giving you slightly more detail, you've got Chios and you have Chesme on the Greek mainland. Now, as war broke out, Noel and his family were actually were on the island of Chios. And when the Germans occupied it, I think it was May 1941, he had to escape with the family at night. Now, the distance actually between the 2 islands is only a couple of kilometers. It's not actually really that far. And he then based the family in Chesme. But what he did establish, and this turned out to be fairly useful later on, was that between the 2 islands, he instituted a telephone line, which was dropped onto the sea bed. So he had direct communication between Chios and Çeşme in Turkey, which turned out to be quite important later on. Being in the right place at the right time with the right contacts meant that he had access to a huge flotilla of kayaks, very well known around the Greek islands. You saw them all the time. That's what people sailed as working boats around the time. So what he did initially was to set up an organization whereby, from what Tom's already mentioned, was to assist in the repatriation and escape of wounded Allied soldiers, British troops, and had them transported to Alexandria out of the way. And as a result of this, he then started to develop the network through which he was able to facilitate the repatriation of, again, as Thomas alluded to, the Greek government, Greek royal family, and an awful lot of people. But what he also managed to do amongst all this lot was to put people back behind the scenes as intelligence gathering forces. So an awful lot of this initially, because there wasn't any government funding, he put his own money, actually quite a small fortune, until the sort of official funds kicked in. Now, only my grandfather could be seen in the back of a kayak wearing a blazer and white flannel. And I think this was sort of a little bit typical of him. He was always beautifully dressed wherever he went. The men in the photographs are all from either the special boat, the SAS, the particular forces that were available around then. SOE obviously was doing quite a lot. They were providing facilities, weapons, explosives, and all the rest of it. What I also discovered whilst I was doing some research about this is that a relative of mine, a Colonel Woolrych, was actually training SOE operatives on the south coast of England, just outside the New Forest. So it's quite possible that some of the people that Colonel Woolrych had trained went out to Greece. I just might like to think that we've got no proof of evidence. A lot of these vessels, they're quite sturdy, they're quite big, you can move a lot of equipment, and this, one of the things that popped up was Force 1, Force 2, who were an amalgam of raiding forces. We're not actually sure which vessel this is. These are handwritten notes from my grandfather, and on these boats, I know he makes X marks a spot. You won't be able to see it because it's a little bit small, but that's where the radio shack is actually located on these vessels. And again, the other one is there. This one is quite important to the way in which all the operation worked. Simi is a small island just off the coast of Rhodes. I've been there many times. It's a lovely little island. There's a nice little monastery there. It's the sort of thing that tourists go to for the day and come back again. But obviously in those days, it was a good place for hiding raiding forces. Not quite sure where this was taken. As you can see, he just says it's in Turkish waters. This is a special boat service lading supplies. And I get another shot of the first landing in Kuşadası in Turkey, having come from Crete. So there was quite a substantial amount of movement around the Mediterranean, bearing in mind that all these are relatively small vessels by comparison to the Axis forces and the shipping that they would have had at their disposal. George Pasparty is one of the people who was I have met He actually came to the presentation that we did at the villa in memory of my grandfather. This is one of the British warships that was again involved on the island of Chios with raiding forces in September 1944, which is obviously getting towards the end of the war years. We have some unknown military personnel. They're probably very high ranking. He doesn't actually annotate who these people are. However, we did know that Brigadier Turnbull, commanding raiding forces in the Aegean, this is a motor law 354. Again, we don't know who the general is. He's come from October. This is obviously getting towards the end of the war years. The Greek Sacred Regiment was the Greeks' equivalent of the SAS and SBS sort of rolled into one. And he notes particularly the correct wearing of that badge. Now, my grandfather was also a member of the Greek Sacred Regiment. Unfortunately, I think my mother has gone and lost his badge. There's a frame which has got all his medals from his OBE service campaign medals, and the one that's missing is the Greek Sacred Regiment. This next one is something I found only recently. This is a telegram, and this is the remains of it, written in as a pencil one. And this was from an agent's report from Piraeus to Izmir Control on the 30th of October. The harbour is to be blown up at any moment to stop German saboteurs, and a small gendarmerie guard is ready to leave by car soon after the destruction. Stop. Pedestrian circulation is prohibited. Stop. Long live Greece. God save the King. Stop. The harbour's had been blown up a minute ago. Long live Greece. So this is about as live. You know, it's almost like Facebook Live in those days that this actually came up, and he didn't even have time to send the original telegram because something else had kicked off in the meantime. And I only found this one a couple of days ago. Then we come into the aftermath of the war years, and the liberation of Chios, and the officer on the right-hand side, that's Noël Rees. I don't know what building they're going into, but this is now the start of the liberation. And again, celebrations in Athens as liberation kicks in, and you may well recognize some of the buildings in the background. They're still there. There was a service of Thanksgiving. Depending on how well you guys know Athens itself, this is Syntagma Square, which is outside the Parliament building. In recent years, you may well have seen it as signs of political unrest and riots. But there is my grandfather. My mother has actually annotated these. The interesting thing is he always spends his time looking at the ground as if he's almost embarrassed to be there. And one of the legacies of war, and this is the sort of the interesting bits about it, these are a couple of things from the villa in Rhodes. You will obviously recognize the swastika. We believe, although we have no actual documented proof of this, and I have tried to research this flag, it was actually made in the Netherlands. I've got the registration number on it, that a German boat captain would only surrender to my grandfather, and he surrendered the flag. A couple of years ago, we had to do an engineer's survey report of the villa and the grounds. And one of the questions that came back to me was, there have been some unplanned illegal developments of which there is no documentation. And I do know that part of the villa had been altered because there's a staircase on the outside which used to go out through the wall, and it's now got a stair on the staircase on the outside of it. And tongue in cheek, I said, "Oh, you don't by any means, any reason, actually think it's the 6-inch gun emplacement the Germans put there during the Second World War?" And they came back and said yes. And I said, "Well, I'm awfully sorry, but that was before we had any planning controls and all the rest of it." And they came back and said, "Yes, well, we'll overlook this one in this case because we understand that that was during the occupation." Now, the irony of some of this occupation, the villa in Rhodes, it was obviously one of the largest private villas on the island, was originally occupied by the Italians because they occupied the island of Rhodes first. And the villa was occupied on the first occasion by the head of the Italian Air Force. He was then ousted by the German general of occupation and obviously flew the swastika above it. Those of you who may actually start to recognize where this may well be going is that you may recognize the motif on the left-hand side of the image, because around the tower here, all the way around it, is this motif, and you will recognize it as that of the Union flag. So during the entire occupation, the German general was under the British flag, and we take a great deal of sort of impish delight in the fact that whilst it was occupied by the Germans, he was still under a British flag. A few years ago, we discovered that the cemetery in Alexandria had been vandalized, and my mother went out to Alexandria and had a number of bodies exhumed, which is quite difficult under Islamic culture, and also had the bodies cremated. Again, a difficult one under Islamic state rule. And she brought them from Alexandria back to Athens in a bag. I mean, literally in plastic bags in her handbag. And one could almost imagine a conversation happening with the customs officials at Athens airport. "Madam, what have you got to declare?" "Well, I've got my father, his brother, you know, and a couple of other relatives." So those who were actually labeled on the bottom end of the mausoleum, which is in the cemetery, or one of the cemeteries in Athens. These were the last 4 bodies that were brought back from Alexandria and interred in the family vault in Athens. You've heard mention already of the book. Well, the book itself is no small tome. For those of you who can still see me in a very small screen, this is it. It's 800 pages and it's all in Greek. Christos Sanmakristakos, who's the gentleman in the bottom left-hand corner in the middle, is the author of the book, and it took several years to put together. This was a bestseller. It sold out the first edition, it sold out the second edition, but it did ruffle an awful lot of feathers, because in the auditorium of the University of Athens, there are an awful lot of former military and government officials for whom this was somewhat uncomfortable reading, because he actually talked about the issues that Tom has already alluded to, that there was a lot of infighting, turf wars, collaboration, and things that people would really have hoped didn't come out. If you want to, it's actually out of print at the moment. It's still advertised on Amazon. We are trying to work on an English translation copy of it, and this is some of it. There's an awful lot of it. which at some point we hope will get published. So it is an interesting read. I've obviously got an awful lot of my information for this evening's presentation from the English translation of it. It's amazing what you can read on a flight back from Rhodes on a 4-hour flight in both directions. On the villa in Rhodes, you saw a picture slightly earlier, right at the beginning of presentation going on. My mother arranged for a ceremony to commemorate my grandfather and the work that he did for Greece during the war years. And I'm quite certain all of you can read that absolutely perfectly, but just in case you can't, there's the English translation of this was done 50 years after his death. I got hauled out there to do an awful lot of the official stuff, because at the time I was also a mayor of Devizes. So my mother wanted mayors, as many as you could find, and I got I won't say roped in, because it was thoroughly enjoyable. So I will just leave you that with my grandfather, who was a little bit of a playboy. He did enjoy dressing up and going to cocktail parties, but he ended up being in the right place at the right time and doing the right thing for a country that he dearly loved and sacrificed his life to, because shortly after that he died of bowel cancer in London, and he could possibly have been treated earlier on in the war had he taken time out, but he didn't, because he loved Greece and he accepted the responsibility of what he was doing fully. So, you know, an awful lot of what was going on, what he did love was sailing, and I think the picture on the right sort of says most of it, but there was a serious side, and he was very good at what he did. So I will leave you with that, and thank you folks for listening.
Can I just add something, Noel?
Yes.
I think we ought to mention the numbers of Greeks and Allied soldiers that he managed to take off the islands and Greeks, because I seem to remember a figure of 14,000.
Yes.
Over the course of
It was
and when you think how small the boats were and what the dangers were and the times of day they had to operate in, and the German boats patrolling the area, it was a pretty remarkable feat. And among those he took off, of course, was George Papandreou, who was one of the first Greek post-war prime ministers.
Yep. Any questions?
Yes, well, thank you very much for that totally fascinating presentation, and we eagerly look forward to the English edition. It's reassuring to know that Levantines in Smyrna weren't just being neutral in the Second World War, but were actively participating in it. Whereas in the First World War, I think helped the Turkish war effort in some cases, making uniforms for the Turkish army. And of course, there are many more questions. How many other Noël Reeses were there in Alexandria and Smyrna and elsewhere? And how much was the embassy in Ankara involved, or SOE in Cairo? To whom exactly was he reporting? I wonder if there are contemporary dispatches and accounts by him. And there weren't only soldiers and personnel being removed from Greece, but also I read at the time of the Syrian civil war, a lot of Greek civilians escaped starvation in Greece through Turkey, through Smyrna and the Aegean coast, I believe. I wonder if he was involved in that. But thank you very much again. And I wonder if he was able to visit Egypt in those years, 1941 to 44.
Yes,
yes,
is an
yes,
answer to that. He was.
yeah. He was summoned there on several occasions.
But actually, all the Rees brothers were in the Navy or RNVR, with the exception of one who was in the army. So they all served in various capacities, either in the First War or the Second War. And all the other points you raised. Oh yes, he reported to MI6, and MRD Foote, who wrote a great history of the Secret Services, has something to do, something to say about his relations with
That one.
Yeah.
I wonder if I might speak. My name is Alexis Castagli. I'm the daughter of the old Harrovian Alexis Theodore Castagli, Major, who became the British consul in Greece after the Civil War, after spending 4 years in prison. I just published a book called Loyal to the Hill, and it is his diary that he wrote when he was 14. And Noël appears many times. On the very early in January, in fact, it was his first year at Harrow. He writes, Rees and Bennett come to stay. And I should be so thrilled to present you with that book, and also with Prouder Than Ever, which is his diary that he wrote during his time as a prisoner, in which he was the information security officer in off-flag 12B Hadamar. And I knew Johnny and Ilona and Freddie and Ethel since I was a child. And it's very touching to hear you, who are his descendants, speak about him. I've always admired him, and it was very hard when I was working on Loyal to the Hill not to fall in love with him.
May I please? It's
Go ahead.
Jason Beard in Istanbul. Noël, Tom, thank you so much. Very enlightening, and a great pleasure to listen to you. A great pleasure. I served as honorary British consul in Alexandretta, Iskenderun, between 1975 and 2000. And my uncle and my great uncle, Augustin Catoni and Joseph Catoni, had done the same in the war years referred to, and Joseph Catoni even before that. When I lived in Iskenderun, I came across the name Rees, and there was correspondence between Joe Catoni, my great uncle, and Rees, and they were talking about things that you've been referring to in your explanations, and the theatre of the south of Turkey, as far as Alexandria, because he also was in the Royal Navy Reserve. So it's fascinating that we should meet and listen. And I'd very much like, when I come to England, to meet and explore where this goes. Thanks to Craig and thanks to our chair, Quentin, for putting us together. Thank you.
Thank you. And it actually raises a question that I had. How many other Levantine descendants were involved in some way during that period? Because they had, in many ways, a unique capability. They traveled a lot. They spoke many languages. They were familiar with crossing boundaries and obstacles. Tom, Noël, and George, did you come across any others in your research?
Well, I can certainly corroborate that, because I come from a half French, half English Levantine family, both of whom had been in one way or another there for a couple of 100 years. And my French side of the family, one of my uncles was responsible for French intelligence during the war in Smyrna. And I recently discovered that the wife of one of my first cousins, French first cousins, was somebody called Seeger, who operated on behalf of American intelligence. So, I mean, they certainly spanned the services.
I wonder if you also know Professor Jack Hampson. He was in the SOE, I think, before even he was sent there, before the German occupation. And my father knew him very well. And they were taken to the same prison together when Crete fell and they were captured. And he comes from a Levantine family.
Hanson, H-A-N-S.
Yes, H-A-M-S-O-N. Yes, Hampson. Jack Hampson.
Yeah, that's a little smaller name.
Yes, yes. Very nice man, I think. Very brave. And he went on to be a Don at Cambridge. Yes, that's right.
Just can I just pick up a chat question that's come through on chat, Philip? We have, there was a question from Christopher Deliso. Can you expand on what the undersea phone cable between us and Turkey was used for, compared with other allied signals intelligence in the war effort?
Yeah, I saw that one pop up. I was just waiting for an opportunity to say something about it. Yeah, it was a secure line. The problem with radio traffic is that in those days, although you could send stuff in code, and most people are familiar with things like Enigma, the most effective means of communication was a single line field telephone type installation, and that went directly from the island of Chios back to the mainland of Turkey, and it was used to provide intelligence very, very quickly and very securely from the German occupied island back to what was Turkey was a neutral country, so that could then be fed out without interruption from anybody back into the intelligence network. So as a facility, better than radio, which in those days, most of the stuff was sent by Morse code. Now, I'm a licensed radio amateur, so I do the diddly-dars. It's not a problem. But when you're sending stuff by Morse, which is very effective over long distance communication, it is subject to being intercepted, and therefore anyone with a decoding cipher, whether it's a code book or something like the Enigma, it can be interfered with and interrupted. But if you have a dedicated line, nobody can listen in. So you've got intelligence coming in at one end, going to intelligence recipient at the other end, and the Germans are not able to listen to it. So that was the main significant advantage of having the undersea cable, which the Germans were completely unaware of as a means of communication between the island.
Could I just add something about that operation from Turkey? Because one of Noel's really outstanding achievements was to secure a British naval base, intelligence base, which was closed to all outsiders, neutral territory of Turkey, which was in principle not supposed to harbor such operations. And he ran the intelligence operation in the Eastern Mediterranean from Chios on this peninsula. And towards the end of the war, the Germans brought a lot of, particularly when things would seem to be going rather well for the Germans, the Germans brought a lot of pressure to bear on the Turks to either close it down or allow them to set up a similar kind of base. And I think they did get some sort of territorial base themselves, but until then, the British had an outstanding territorial advantage over all the other services, because nobody could get into the base and they could do exactly what they liked and land who they liked on this land for the first probably 2 or 3 years of the war. Nobody yet knows how, and the official files are still closed on the means which he used to persuade the Turks to allow this thing to happen. We can all speculate. We don't
know. Any other questions or comments that people have?
Where exactly was that base?
It was on that Cheshme Peninsula,
Yes.
at Khioste.
Khioste.
Yes, Khioste. Yeah.
There could possibly be some interesting archaeology done there.
Possibly.
But I may have missed it. The Villa Alice in Rhodes, is that still a private villa for the family, or is it open to the public?
Yes, it's come to the point where we have to sell it. So if any of you have got €5 million, I'll take any bids. It's quite a lot of work doing on it. My mother's lived there for the last 20 years. She's now, as George alluded to earlier, she has frontotemporal dementia and is living in London, where it's much easier to care for her. Yeah, we go out there periodically and make certain it's okay. It is being maintained. It is of significant archaeological interest because the architect who we believe built it also built the hunting lodge for the governor of Rhodes up in the mountains. It is alluded to have been Mussolini's hunting lodge. Unfortunately, that's not actually true, although that's the received version that the Greeks would like to go with. That building has fallen into disrepair and is basically a ruin. The villa itself has a preservation order on it and is of significant architectural interest. Yeah, it's whoever buys it would have to keep it in very much in the custom of which it is was intended. Built in an Italian design. It's still there. It's about 25 meters from the sea or thereabouts, so you get a totally uninterrupted view of the Turkish coast, which of course Germans liked it during the war because it's the only way any vessels can pass along the strait, along the south coast of Turkey, and well within 6-inch gun range. Indeed, for those of you who may have seen the film The Guns of Navarone, that was actually filmed on the island of Rhodes, and a lot of the props were built in the garden, and some of there were 1 or 2 scenes also filmed in the garden, so it has featured in 1 or 2 interesting the result.
Okay, thank you. A question come through on chat from Viron Karidis. Thank you very much for a fascinating story. Can the speakers expand a little more on the relations between MI6, MI9 and the SOE people in Greece? Now, I know you touched on this, but is there more to say?
Yeah, I think Tom, do you want to do that? Take that one?
Well, the conflicts between them were very widely known at the time, but they weren't broadcast abroad, obviously, because very bad. But there are several records of very heated conversations between the heads of SOE and MI6 and MI9 in Cairo. And there was an overarching directorate, and I think Commander Wolfson was the man who was responsible for coordinating the intelligence services from Cairo, and it required a big diplomatic effort. And so in the end, there was a sort of uneasy collaboration between these three arms. But what happened was that the attempt to take over the MI6 and MI9 operation, which was large scale, I mean, there were about, I think, 80 staff running these two operations in Smyrna. And both SOE and OSS wanted to get their hands on the resources. And they were repelled, fought off, so that MI6 and MI9 could do their job properly. So relations remained pretty tense, I think, until the end of the war, but they were all aware that they needed to collaborate and that they were all working to a common cause. So it never came to a kind of showdown, but there were several standoffs. I can't tell you much more than that, but there's it's quite interesting. There's a book called an American author, I think, called Archaeological Spies, about the American intelligence effort there, and a lot of very negative stuff about Noël Rees and that, because he was seen as husbanding the British intelligence resources and fending the American. And who knows, there may be some truth in that, but he didn't want his smooth running of his operation, which was running very smoothly, to be messed up.
Okay, thank you very much. Any last thoughts or questions? Yes, I see a hand up. Viron, do you want to speak?
Yeah, thank you very much. Have you got any documentation about personalities? Let's say the relations of Rees with Woodhouse and Eddie Myers. Have we got any documentation on their relationship?
I certainly haven't directly. I mean, there is some published stuff, because Monty Woodhouse, I think, published a bit. But I don't know. I don't know if Noël has found anything in his papers, but
no, I haven't. I mean, when Petros was doing a lot of the research, he was fairly diligent in what he could find, but an awful lot of the research was literally done by word of mouth and going out and talking to people. So a lot of it was done by memory. Any documentation we have that was permitted to be released by the security services, and I know Tom has sort of alluded to some of it, there is still information that is still classified, not and was literally blocked when we asked about when Petros was asking and doing his research, and similarly for my mother, the answer just came back, no, it's still classified information. So what we had to work on was word of mouth, memory, and that's really, you know, where this kind of research sort of falls at certain hurdles. You can't necessarily get all the information, so there is probably still stuff out there that we don't know about, and it would be useful if anybody does have any more information that we can put together, because it only comes from people who have met, survived, served with, were in that field of influence. That's where we've got our information from. So it's quite difficult when you are limited, because the documentation has effectively been locked off and we're not allowed to have access to it.
I was trying to me.
Yes, yes.
I was trying to find out whether it was a matter of politics or whether it was a matter of personalities. Because I suppose a considerable group of the SOE people in Greece, they were against the communists.
Yes, some were.
So it was not just a matter that the MI6 and MI9 supported the monarchists and the SOE, let's say, was pro-communist or pro-guerrillas, Elas. For instance, I don't think that Woodhouse, who was running the show in Greece, was a pro-EAM or pro-Elas supporter. On the contrary, what the SOE people wanted and their goal was to have achievements on the ground. That's why they were supporting a resistance movement which was extremely successful in fighting the Germans. And you were right, they were not thinking too much about what was going to happen to Greece after the liberation. Their main goal was to throw the Germans out of the country. So I was wondering whether it was not just politics, but it was a matter of personalities as well, and infighting as well between the secret services here in Britain, who is going to control the show in Smyrna and in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Aegean, and who is going actually to control the money that they were coming in order to help the resistance in Greece. That's why I'm thinking whether there are any letters, anything which has not been published. I'm aware of the fact that a lot of the SOE documents, are classified, and we don't know when they will open for researchers.
Yeah, I think you're quite right that the SOE itself was not a left-wing political force. In both sets of services, there were left sympathizers and right sympathizers and monarchists and anti-monarchists. The conflict really, I think, was between these two very different modes of operation. One is very surreptitious, behind the scenes, not wanting to be noticed operation. And the other, the spectacular, morale boosting, courageous operations of the SOE, which, undoubtedly did a lot to boost the morale of the resistance. But as somebody said, it was stirring the hornet's nest.
What was the position of Churchill towards MI6 and MI9?
Well, it was Churchill who was all in favor of SOE, and
that's what I'm asking you.
Sorry?
Churchill, I think, was in favor of SOE.
Yes, very much so. Yeah. He was in favor of dramatic interventions and raising the spirits of occupied countries. But he also sent a lot of SOE operatives to their deaths because, a lot of the spectacular ventures were really impossible to realize.
All right, thank you very much. I think it's time to bring this to a close, but certainly it sounds as though the research continues, and if people do have information sources that might be useful, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're very happy to connect you up so that the work can continue. So can I just thank George, Noel, Tom very much for your talk, for all the hard work that's gone into preparing it. Fascinating account, and certainly I look forward to seeing more over the coming years. And thank you to our audience for participating and for sharing your news and information. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.